Hello, I'm Melanie Moon, and I'm continuing reading Race and the City about the city of Cincinnati. Gives some great historical information. The book it's a compilation of essays that were written for the Cincinnati's bicentennial. I think that was in 1988. The essays were compiled by Henry Louis Taylor Jr., and we are now on Chapter 5, which was written by Nancy Bertaux. It is entitled Structural Economic Change and Occupational Decline Among Black Workers in 19th-Century Cincinnati. The employment aspects of life in Cincinnati's Black community are and have always been of utmost importance in understanding many other aspects of that life, including socioeconomic status, residential location, and educational attainment. Indeed, the occupational hierarchy is arguably the chief mechanism that creates and perpetuates the American version of the class system. Blacks who have been able to significantly increase their socioeconomic status have done so by breaking out of the occupations to which they have traditionally been confined. Occupational segregation by race, whereby blacks are concentrated in a limited number of job categories, has been a key factor in keeping blacks as a group at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. Footnote. And I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try not to say footnote because, as I stated before, all of this information is well documented from authoritative sources, which are in the footnotes at the end of the chapter. So anything that I state here, you can pretty much take to the bank. While the empirical existence of job segregation by race and its negative effects on blacks' economic status have been generally accepted, the cause of this segregation has been the subject of continuing debate. Some scholars insist that labor supply factors can explain the different occupational profiles of blacks and whites, arguing that quote-unquote human capital deficits of blacks, such as less or lesser quality education, training, and work experience, have resulted in blacks' concentration in lower paying, lower prestige jobs. Other scholars pose various theories of racial discrimination, arguing that racist practices emanating from employers, white employees, or from more impersonal labor market institutions have kept blacks from achieving an occupational distribution similar to that of whites. Looking at the historical development of occupational segregation by race makes it abundantly clear that the human capital explanation is insufficient to account for 19th century occupational trends. Other immigrant groups came to America with human capital endowments quite similar to those of blacks, yet were able to make substantially greater economic progress through their quicker access to a wider range of occupations. Racism and racial discrimination played an undeniable role in creating the low-paid, low-status occupational profile that continues to plague much of the Black community today. And this is not difficult to document historically. What is more challenging is to identify the dynamics of this discrimination over place and time. This chapter examines how structural changes in the economy of 19th century Cincinnati intersected with trends in racism, immigration, and population growth to produce a clear pattern of occupational decline for the city's Black community in the context of continuing occupational segregation by race. Cincinnati's Blacks had surely been at a disadvantage in the labor market from the city's earliest days. But in the late 19th century, when Cincinnati underwent the dynamic change from a pre-industrial to an industrial economy, Blacks' occupational status actually worsened. In the second half of the 19th century, Cincinnati evolved from a pre-industrial, commercially based walking city focused on its riverfront, 1820s to the 1850s, to the sprawling manufacturing-based industrial center, 1860s onward. Industrialization, the bureaucratization of business firms, and investment in public services were major influences of the character of Cincinnati's economy in this era. These structural economic changes deeply affected the lives of both black and white workers, as they resulted in a changing distribution of job opportunities. Analysis of occupational trends shows that while many white workers, especially artisans, experienced job dislocation, white workers as a whole were able to take advantage of the new quote-unquote good jobs that were created by industrialization. Black workers, however, clearly occupied a deteriorating position in the labor force amid the dynamic economic shifts of the late 20th century, from 1860 to 1890. The most prestigious occupations that black men and women had managed to enter, such as barber and teacher, became less important in the black workforce, while the low-status occupations of laborer and domestic servant increasingly dominated the occupational profile of Cincinnati's blacks. The occupations that blacks entered in greater and greater numbers were also the very occupations that whites were leaving for the better opportunities now available to them in the industrialized economy. Moreover, this occurred amid a substantial decline in formalized racism, as many discriminatory barriers were eliminated through reforms in the legal arena. Thus, what would appear to have been a period full of positive opportunities for blacks resulted in economic stagnation and decline for black workers. The new jobs generated by industrialization and the new legal climate created a post-Civil War reforms. Let me read that again. The new jobs generated by industrialization and the new legal climate created by post-Civil War reforms did not, in fact, produce an economic renaissance for Cincinnati blacks. This chapter will argue that a variety of increasingly informal discriminatory barriers initiated by institutions as well as by employers and white workers explains this apparent paradox. The current literature on occupational trends among blacks in post-Civil War America often contrasts events in the South, that is, the rise of the sharecropping system, Jim Crow laws, and so on, with those in the North, that is, discriminatory labor unions, the use of blacks as strikebreakers, and so on. An examination of the complexities surrounding the occupational status of blacks in 19th century Cincinnati, a borderland city, should enrich our understanding of the history of black workers during the dawning of the industrial age. Looking at black workers in the 19th century also lays a foundation for considering both the achievements and frustrations of 20th century blacks. The post-World War II period has witnessed a major structural shift in the U.S. economy as our industrial manufacturing-based economy continues evolving into a post-industrial economy centered on service and high technology. Once again, this structural change, which would appear to offer new opportunities for blacks to move forward economically, has also been taking place at a time when racist barriers appear to be falling. This time, due to a variety of civil rights laws and affirmative action programs. Despite this situation, Evidence suggests that these economic changes, while benefiting better educated blacks, may be resulting in occupational decline for blacks as a whole. Thus, the story of black workers in the 19th century may help us to understand economic trends in the black community today. Job competition, population growth, and the labor market. Before the specific occupational structure of the black community in pre-industrial and industrial Cincinnati is considered, the demographic context must be briefly sketched. Since workers are drawn from the overall population trends are important in understanding labor force trends. Thus, the pattern of black population growth as well as the growth of the immigrant population should be established. Labor force participation rates are also relevant in looking at the overall employment status of blacks. In spite of the small percentage of blacks in 19th century Cincinnati, less than 5%, the absolute size of Cincinnati's black population was one of the largest among northern cities throughout the century. In the antebellum period, Cincinnati was an obvious potential residence for freed or runaway slaves due to its location as the southernmost city in a free state. Kentucky, where slavery was legal, was across the Ohio River. This borderland status cut both ways. While Cincinnati was a hotbed of abolitionism during this era, its strong Southern ties and heritage also contributed to frequent outbreaks of extreme racism, which sometimes caused declines in the growth of the black population. The most blatant example occurred in the late 1820s, when at least 1,000 blacks, probably about half the blacks in Cincinnati at that time, were driven from the city by whites determined to enforce Ohio's previously enacted black laws. Ohio's black laws had been passed in 1804 to 1807, and they required all blacks to register with local officials, show certificates of freedom, and post a bond of $500 to guarantee good behavior. These laws also prohibited blacks from testifying against whites in court, holding public office, or serving in the military. Ohio's 1802 Constitution had already denied blacks suffrage. And I have heard this before in previous essays, chapters that I have read, and I'm sure if you're reading with me, along with me, hearing what I'm reading, you've heard this before about the black laws. So we've got that pretty much down pat, 1804 black laws and the limitations placed upon blacks due to those laws. While decennial census figures show a continual increase in the size of Cincinnati's black population during the 19th century, Table 5.1, the trend in the percentage of non-whites, almost all of whom were black and mulatto, was U-shaped. Only after the Civil War did the proportion of blacks in the city's population begin slowly to rise. Even by the turn of the century, this proportion was still below the antebellum peak. This was due to the vast inflows of European immigrants, primarily German and Irish, that occurred in the antebellum era. While blacks outnumbered the foreign-born in 1825, by 1840, there were over twice as many foreign-born as black Cincinnatians, and in 1850, the ratio was over 16-1. While the proportion of blacks in the population never reached 5% in the 19th century, the proportion of foreign-born grew to over 47% in 1850. After 1850, the immigration slowed dramatically, and the proportion of foreign-born fell for the rest of the century, although it was still nearly 18% in 1900. The presence of large numbers of first and second generation immigrants meant that Black workers often faced stiff competition, even in low status occupations. Competition with Irish born workers was especially intense, and there is a footnote for that. While Irish workers outnumbered Black workers by 7-1 in 1860, by 1890, the number of Irish born and Black workers was roughly equal. Table 5.2. Labor force participation. An important indicator of the work status of a population is the labor force participation rate, which is defined as the proportion of the population that is in the labor force. In Cincinnati, throughout the late 19th century, 1860 to 1890, Black labor force participation rates were higher than those for whites, 54.8 versus 47.2%. And women's rates were a fraction of those of men, roughly 15 to 20% versus 60 to 65%, Table 5.3. The labor force participation rates for men and for whites rose during the latter part of the 19th century, but the rates for women and non-whites rose faster. The result was a labor force that was increasingly female and increasingly non-white, based on the non-white labor force and the female labor force as a percent of the total labor force, Table 5.3. By 1890, about 28% of the Cincinnati labor force was either Black, female, or both. The lower labor force participation rates of women were primarily due to women's unpaid work of caring for their families at home, which left them outside the official labor force. The higher labor force participation rates of Blacks were due to a number of factors, most of which centered around the lower earnings of their families. Blacks began work at a younger age, which was related to their receiving fewer years of education. Black workers were financially unable to retire as early as whites, and more Black family members, especially women, were needed as workers in order to cover basic necessities. Indeed, even when compared to other ethnic groups, Black women's work rates appear high based on figures showing how the proportion of female workers in the overall workforce varied among different races and nationalities in 1860 and 1890. Table 5.2. The percentage of the labor force that was female was highest in the Black community. The Irish ran a fairly close second to Blacks on this percentage, in accordance with their similarly low economic status. Native U.S., German, and English women were significantly less likely to work. Black families' low earnings are especially sobering when their higher labor force participation rates are considered. In effect, they worked harder to earn less. Much of the reason for this phenomenon lies in the very restricted nature of the occupations in which Blacks were generally employed. Moreover, as the city's economy developed, Blacks did not attain much upward mobility in the occupational arena. In fact, the structural economic changes that occurred in the late 19th century appear to have worked against instead of for Blacks. The pre-industrial racial division of labor. The city's Black community developed during the period in which Cincinnati was building its reputation as the mercantile center of the West. Cincinnati's favorable location on the Ohio River in the steamboat era helped it become the fastest growing city in the country. during the late 1830s and 1840s. By the mid-1820s, Cincinnati had one of two steamers a day stopping at its public landing. Let me read that again. By the mid-1820s, Cincinnati had one or two steamers a day stopping at its public landing. By 1830, Cincinnati was the economic leader of the West, the Queen City. It was the distribution center for supplies destined for large parts of Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Illinois, and Missouri. Timothy Flint, the publisher of Western Monthly Review, reckoned in 1830 that Cincinnati was the central market town for 1 million people. For the early decades of the city's history, information on the actual occupations of Black Cincinnatians participating in the labor force is somewhat spotty and impressionistic. The earliest description of Cincinnati note that most Black men labored on steamboats or on the riverfront, or on internal improvement projects such as road and canal construction, and as common laborers in all areas of the city's economy. Some also worked as porters, messengers, shoe blacks, and vendors. Black women frequently worked as domestics. Certainly the experiences of Black and white workers in Cincinnati had always been quite different. Dr. Daniel Drake, in his account of Cincinnati in 1815, wrote that the city's small number of Blacks were, quote, disciplined to laborious occupations, unquote, and, quote, prone to the performance of light and menial drudgery, unquote. Around the same time, Cincinnati editor Timothy Flint referred to Cincinnati's borderland status when he noted that, quote, the evils of slavery are not confined to the parts of the country where involuntary labor exists, but the neighborhood is infected. Certain kinds of labor are despised as being the work of slaves. Unquote. Footnote. Although the U.S. Census did not collect information on occupations until 1850 males and 1860 males and females, there are city directories that list occupations along with individuals' names. Data from the city directories should be used with great caution, since studies that cross-reference census and directory entries show that the early Cincinnati directories grossly undercounted Blacks, transients, and the poor in general, while they completely excluded all working women who were not considered heads of household. This obviously limits their usefulness for present purposes. For example, the directories failed to count domestic servants who typically lived with their employers and were not considered household heads. Still, the directories do give us some ideas about the occupational distribution available to Blacks, and the most common occupations listed in directories continue to be important later in the century when census data are available. For instance, the 1836 to 37 directory listed 163 Black household heads, 25 of whom were female. Among Black males, there were 28 laborers, 20% of the Black males listed, 24 boatmen and steamboat stewards, 70%, and 22 barbers, 16%. The Black females were nearly all washerwomen, 23 or 92%. Blacks listed in the 1840, 1842, and 1844 directories had smaller occupational distributions. From the limited information available, it would appear safe to conclude that in the commercial stage of Cincinnati's economy, job opportunities for Blacks consisted of physical labor, much of which was centered around the riverfront and the provisions of personal service to whites. It is clear that the restricted set of occupations available to blacks in pre-industrial Cincinnati was strongly related to the many doors that were closed to blacks during this period. A variety of social institutions, including government, educational institutions, and trade unions, were as well as private employers and white workers in general worked to keep blacks out of the mainstream. A black traveler to Cincinnati in 1827 reported that, quote, "I thought upon coming to a free state like Ohio, I would find every door thrown open to receive me. But from the treatment I received by the people generally, I found it little better than in Virginia. I found every door was closed against the colored man in a free state, excepting the jails and penitentiaries." Ooh, does that sound familiar? 2019? Oh my gosh. Indeed, and that's end quote. There's a footnote. I'd love to read that source. Indeed, even the poorhouse was closed to blacks. So another of the provisions of the black laws mentioned earlier was that destitute, unemployed blacks were ineligible for poor relief. Footnote. Blacks were heavily discriminated against in the educational arena. Black youths were barred from attending the public schools that had opened in 1829, and attempts to establish separate black schools were resisted. In 1830, the first ward, quote, "people of color petitioned the legislature that the school be open for black children." Oh, this is a long quote. Okay, so I'm going to go back. In 1830, the first ward, quote, "people of color petitioned the legislature that a school be open for black children." When the legislature failed to respond positively, 3 abolitionists began teaching black pupils in the East End. Another abolitionist founded a school in the West End in the 1830s. Mob violence frequently kept scholars from attending these schools, and the white teachers were refused accommodation in boarding houses. End quote. Although special private schools did operate for blacks intermittently over the early part of the 19th century, it was reported in 1845 that over half of Cincinnati's blacks were illiterate. In addition to being ineligible to attend public schools, even though many paid taxes, privately educated blacks were not permitted to enroll in professional schools, such as the Cincinnati Medical College in 1837. Footnote. The dramatic surge in German and Irish immigrants who settled in Cincinnati in the 1830s and 1840s had a significant impact on the local labor market. Woodson has argued that in antebellum Cincinnati, the presence of large numbers of German and Irish immigrants willing to do menial labor greatly restricted job opportunities for black men. Quote, "Since the Negroes could not follow ordinary menial occupations, that there was nothing left them but the lowest form of drudgery, for which employers often preferred colored women. It was therefore necessary in some cases for the mother to earn the living for the family because the father could get nothing to do." End quote. That sounds familiar. In 1838, Germans denounced a Cincinnati newspaper editor for his suggestion that blacks should be considered the equals of immigrant Germans, since they competed for the same jobs. The editor then modified his stance, stating that blacks should continue their monopoly on street sweeping and table serving. Footnote, if you want to read the source of that statement. Inside and outside trade unions, The city's white workers were known to protest against working with blacks, especially when blacks were not in the subordinate position. White protests were frequently rooted in the feeling, quote, that it was a disgrace to work with Negroes, unquote. Blacks were reportedly denied membership in early trade unions, and the president of a local mechanics association, quote, was publicly tried in 1830 by that organization for the crime of assisting a colored youth to learn a trade, unquote. An incident from the 1830s illustrates the barriers faced by skilled black workers. A young cabinet maker who had purchased his freedom in Kentucky came to Cincinnati to find work and succeeded in obtaining a position. Quote, on entering the establishment, however, the workmen threw down their tools, declaring that the Negro had to leave or that they would. The unfortunate intruder was accordingly dismissed. Footnote. The colored job market. In 1850, the U.S. Census collected information on occupation by race for male workers only, but did not publish summaries of this data. Recently, scholars have summarized and analyzed the occupations of black men in 1850 by using data from manuscript returns. Consistent with the data from the earlier city directories, the top 5 occupations for black men in 1850 were, in order of frequency, boatman, barber, cook, laborer, and waiter. Together, these 5 occupations accounted for 2/3 of all black male workers. By 1860, information on the occupations of black Cincinnati workers by sex as well as race became available from the decennial U.S. Census. For most of the 20th century, the census did not summarize occupations by race and sex, even at the national level, although the information was available on the original returns. For 1890 only, census volumes were published that summarize occupations by race and sex at the U.S. level and for the states and major cities, including Cincinnati. For 1860, I used an original database consisting of a 5% random sample of all individuals listed as having occupations in the manuscript returns of the 1860 population census. The 1860 data were summarized for comparability to the 1890 figures. And the overall size of the Cincinnati labor force by race and sex for 1860 and 1890 was calculated. Table 5.2. The distribution of occupations by race and sex in 1860 illustrates the fact that there was more overlap in the occupations of whites and blacks of one gender than for males and females of the same race. Table 5.4. The same pattern is evident in the distribution of occupations in 1890, Table 5.5. Thus, in 19th century Cincinnati, the occupations of black men and women followed the traditional men's work and women's work patterns. Cincinnati blacks of both sexes were disproportionately likely to hold the lowest status occupations within these categories, Table 5.6. By 1860, black and white men and women occupied distinct occupational niches in the labor market, Table 5.4. In 1860, laborer was the most important occupation for both white and black males, but categories such as clerical/sales, traders, and dealers, and the traditional crafts were more important for white males. Such categories accounted for about 40% of the white male labor force. but blacks were virtually excluded from these occupations. Black men were much more likely than whites to work at low-status jobs, such as dock worker and boatmen, and in hotels, restaurants, and miscellaneous, quote-unquote, manufacturing and personal service. Becoming a barber was the most prestigious choice available to more than 10% of black male workers. Writing in the 1920s, the black publisher Wendell P. Dabney described the black barbers of the mid-19th century in sentimental terms, and I quote, "In the early days, colored men enjoyed a monopoly of the barber business. Barber shops were the great places for gossip, and the white customers were generally quite well informed as to the doings of Negro society. The patrons and barbers were very chummy in many ways. The Negro barber, as a workman, was an artist. The razor in his hand became an instrument that made sweet melody as it charmed away the grass that grew on facial lawns." Unquote. Small numbers of black men also found relative success in the field of catering, and some of the black stewards on steamboats were able to make a good living on the tips they received. Similarly, black and white women were concentrated in different areas of traditional women's work. The majority of white females worked as domestic servants and in the sewing trades. In 1860, although significant proportions of black women worked at these occupations, they were much more likely than white women to be lawn dressers or hotel and restaurant workers. Table 5.6. Although none of the major occupational categories open to women were well-paying or prestigious, the laundress category that black women dominated involved particularly heavy and tedious work. Although no black women teachers showed up in the 1860 sample, a tiny group of them, less than 1% of the black female labor force, taught in the officially segregated black public schools from the 1850s to the 1870s, under the direction of the prominent black leader, Peter H. Clark. The teachers of these schools were, of course, some of the most highly educated black workers in the city. Many had received their education in the city's black private schools, including the well-known and respected Gilmore High School. In the early 1850s, Cincinnati blacks had finally succeeded in their effort to establish black public schools after winning an extensive legal battle with the city administration that ended up in the Ohio Supreme Court. This struggle to establish public schools for black children in Cincinnati stands in marked contrast to the relative ease with which the city's German immigrants were able to attain German-speaking schools for their children. And there's a footnote there. Examining 1860 census data on occupations typically held by other 19th century ethnic groups shows that, as in the case of female labor force participation, the Irish were the most similar to blacks. While U.S.-born men were likely to work in white-collar jobs such as clerical and sales occupations, and German men in the sewing trades and as craftsmen, Irish men usually worked as laborers, boatmen, drivers, and hotel servants. While U.S.-born women with native-born parents often worked as teachers or bookbinders, those with foreign parents frequently did factory work. German women also worked as traders, dealers, and peddlers, and Irish women also worked as laundresses, hotel servants, and domestic servants. While the major inflows of Irish and German immigrants to Cincinnati occurred at the same time, the Irish were much slower to rise in the socioeconomic order than the Germans, due at least in part to the lower rates of literacy and capital ownership among Irish immigrants. In addition to occupational similarities, analysis of residential patterns tell us that Irish and Negroes shared the Ohio River bottoms with wholesale houses and factories. The physical proximity of blacks and Irish, combined with the fact that the two ethnic groups competed for many of the same low-paying jobs, frequently created conflict. The historian Steve J. Ross relates the following incident from the early months of the Civil War, when Cincinnati's river trade was severely disrupted and violence erupted amid the hardships of unemployment among dock workers. Quote, "Screaming, 'Let's clear out the niggers!' Irish dock workers, angered by the attempts of black laborers to underbid them for jobs, initiated a 2-day riot in July 1862, which left a trail of destruction that stretched from the city's docks to the black homes along the levee." Unquote. Footnote. Several years later, however, the post-Civil War flurry of labor organizing led, at least temporarily, to a significant turnaround in the attitudes of black and Irish dock workers, who joined together in June 1866 and marched en masse to the city's docks to demand better pay for all. In the long run, of course, this solidarity did not last, and workers of Irish descent fared much better than black workers. As we will see later, by the late 19th century, Irish-born workers managed to show significant progress in their occupational distribution. Although Cincinnati's black workers were clearly at a disadvantage with respect to other workers in the occupational structure of pre-industrial Cincinnati, a comparison of their status with blacks in other cities shows that Cincinnati's blacks did relatively well during this period. Kenneth L. Kusmer has pointed out that in this era, the fast-growing Midwestern cities generally proved to be more economically hospitable to blacks than the older cities in the North or South, with the notable exceptions of the relatively flourishing black communities in antebellum New Orleans and Boston. The occupational distribution of Cincinnati's black workers in 1860 looked very similar to those of Detroit in the 1850s and 60s time frame. Antebellum Cleveland, with its history of relative racial tolerance, produced an occupational distribution for blacks that was only slightly more favorable than that of Cincinnati. The changing structure of the economy. Between 1860 and 1890, industrialization caused dramatic structural changes in the Cincinnati economy that had a negative impact on the jobs available to black workers. The economic focus of the city shifted from commerce to manufacturing, and Cincinnati became an important national player in the production of a variety of goods. By 1850, the labor force, capital, and transportation networks generated by Cincinnati's mercantile success had already helped make the city a manufacturing center of national importance. The 1850 census showed that while Cincinnati was the 6th largest city in the country, it was the nation's 3rd largest manufacturing center. After 1860, however, Cincinnati became increasingly reliant on manufacturing as an economic base due to the city's fall from regional commerce dominance. By the eve of the Civil War, railroads had dramatically altered east-west trade routes and the magic of Cincinnati's Ohio River location faltered. Although Cincinnati did build several railroads quite early, the first was completed in 1847. It failed to become part of any of the major east-west railroad routes that gained momentum beginning in the early 1850s. Private Cincinnati investors of the 1850s stayed away from railroads since most of the early railroads failed to pay dividends. Contemporary observers blamed city leaders for lack of vision, claiming that they did not invest enough money in railroads or invest fast enough. But the rise of cities like St. Louis and Chicago involved more than Cincinnati's mistakes. The railroad extended the boundaries of cultivation as it harnessed the power of steam for use on land. A Cincinnati historian pointed out that, quote, railroads were effects as well as causes. Chicago benefited from railroads just as Cincinnati benefited from steamboats, and Chicago was building its trade on the agricultural productivity of the Mississippi Valley, just as Cincinnati had earlier profited from the productivity of its surrounding region. End quote. Footnote. While Cincinnati's economy grew steadily throughout the 19th century, Cincinnati's reign as the Queen of the West was over, and the decline of the steamboat had a particularly noticeable effect on the occupations of black workers. As we have seen, a high proportion of black men worked in steamboat-related jobs, such as boatmen, firemen, and stevedore. Black men thus bore a disproportionate amount of the burden resulting from this economic dislocation. For example, by 1890, less than 2% of white or black men worked as steamboatmen. For white men, this category had accounted for 4% of all jobs in 1860, while the figure for black men was 13%. The latter half of the 19th century was not, however, a period of general economic decline for the city as a whole. Although Cincinnati had to readjust, much new growth came from manufacturing and from investment in city utilities and transportation facilities. The city moved from booming growth to slow and steady growth. The growth of manufacturing in late 19th century Cincinnati took place in a diversified fashion, with the city playing regional or national roles in the production of carriages, furniture, boots and shoes, machine tools, soap, and pork products. This shift toward manufacturing was accompanied by substantial technological and organizational changes, which led to new workforce arrangements that usually did not include blacks. As the pace of the workplace for individual workers sharply changed, the antebellum workshop was transformed into the modern factory. The scale of individual businesses grew larger. Production processes were reorganized, mechanization was increasingly utilized, and many jobs became more specialized. This transformation meant that many traditional craftsman jobs, which had been heavily dominated by white men, declined in importance. To save on labor costs, low-paid white women and children were increasingly employed in many manufacturing establishments. Blacks, though, were rarely hired for these new factory jobs. Thus, they failed to benefit from one of the crucial workforce shifts that occurred in the transition from the pre-industrial to an industrial economy. For white male workers, although the traditional crafts declined, the elite trade of machinist gained in importance. Upwardly mobile jobs in the clerical and sales area increased, and the proportion of workers employed in common labor dropped dramatically, Compare tables 5.4 and 5.5. Many white males then were able to take advantage of the positive opportunities that arose in the industrializing, bureaucratizing firms in this era. Even the Irish, the group historically relegated to occupations most similar to those of blacks, registered occupational gains in the late 19th century. By 1890, significant proportions of Irish-born men and women held jobs as clerical and sales workers, traders and dealers, iron and steel workers, blacksmiths, masons, policemen, and boot and shoemakers, while none of these categories were important for black workers. Not that they weren't important, I don't agree with that word, but they weren't available to black workers. In contrast, the occupational status of black men appears to have unambiguously worsened. Blacks lost their hold in the relatively prestigious barbering business due to competition from white barbers. Dabney described this turn of events as follows, and I quote, "White men came into the barber business. The Negro barbers laughed. More white men came. Less laughing. The white man brought business methods. He stood for the ridicule and kept working. Quite easy, like the boll weevil in a crop of cotton. He gave new names to old things. Sanitary and sterilized became his great words. The open sesame for the coming generation. Negro barber shops for white patrons melted away as snow before a July sun." End quote. The occupations of messenger and driver were the only new job categories accounting for more than 2% of the black male workforce. Furthermore, as white men shifted away from the occupation of labor, black men increasingly became common laborers. By 1890, 37% of black male workers were laborers, compared with 18% in 1860. During this period, black men also became much more likely to work as domestic servants, which was, once again, an occupation that was declining in importance for the overall labor force. By 1890, 22% of black male workers were servants, compared with 5% in 1860. By 1890, then, the majority of black men were employed as laborers or servants. Likewise, in the female labor market, black women increasingly worked in jobs that white women were abandoning for the better opportunities available to them in the industrializing economy. The most important trend for white women workers was a decreased reliance on the occupation of domestic servant. Black women, however, showed a dramatic increase in this occupation. From 1860 to 1890, the proportion of black women employed as servants increased from 14 to 46%. By 1890, sizable numbers of white women moved into clerical and sales jobs, teaching posts, and factory jobs in the textile, boot and shoe, and cigar industries. Black women did not. In fact, even the small elite core of black teachers in Cincinnati's segregated public schools declined in the late 19th century. The black school system was gradually absorbed into the white system following school desegregation legislation at the state level. In the process, most black teachers, as well as male principals, were phased out, and the influence of those who remained waned. The primary reason for the reduction in black teachers was that white parents and school officials would not allow them to teach classes that included white pupils. Similarly, black principals were not permitted to supervise white teachers. Do I sound angry? The overall pattern in late 19th century Cincinnati was thus one of blacks increasingly moving into those occupations that became less important for whites. And maybe important is a good term. I'll take that back. While being excluded from the new occupations that were gaining in importance for whites due to structural economic change, in effect, blacks were picking up job market leftovers. Other studies of black occupational status in the latter half of the 19th century in cities such as Cleveland, Detroit, and Milwaukee have reached similar conclusions. Part of the explanation for this phenomenon can be found in the supply side of the labor market. On average, the black migrants of the post-Civil War period probably differed from earlier black settlers. They may have been less literate, less skilled, less familiar with an urban environment, or more likely to have worked in agriculture prior to migrating. However, after having arrived in the city, they faced a variety of discriminatory practices that worked against upward occupational mobility for blacks, keeping them at the bottom of the economic ladder longer than white immigrant groups who had arrived with similar backgrounds. Ironically, legal barriers to racial inequality in Ohio were being reduced in this period. In the 3 decades after the Civil War, blacks were granted the right to vote, and the Ohio State Legislature passed public accommodation laws, repealed the remaining vestiges of the black laws, and enacted legislation to give black children the opportunity to attend white public schools. Nevertheless, blacks continued to be excluded from many occupations by a variety of barriers that included the written and unwritten policies of companies, trade unions, and city government, as well as the racism of white employers and employees. Studies found that Cincinnati's racial tension, which had surely existed from the city's earliest decades, actually increased in these decades. In 1889, a local newspaper noted that, quote, "the color line is everywhere," unquote. As the political activism of blacks increased, so did the resentment of many white citizens. In addition, the extended economic depressions of the 1870s and 1890s brought unemployment and increased competition for jobs, a historical source of conflict between black and white members of the working class. In any event, the white community perceived the black migrants of the post-Civil War era as an increasingly unfavorable light, in an increasingly unfavorable light. In the public sector, blacks were barred from city jobs, such as public health inspectors and firemen on the grounds of the public, as well as fellow employees would object to taking orders from blacks or working in close quarters with them. The few remaining black teachers in the public schools were not permitted to supervise white children, and black principals were restricted to schools with all black teaching staffs. Blacks were excluded by the constitutions or policies of nearly all trade unions, including the plasterers, carpenters, painters, and printers unions. Even unions that admitted some blacks engaged in other discriminatory practices. In occupations such as hod carrier, blacks were organized into segregated locals. Blacks were kept out of lucrative new trades such as the plumbing and electrical trades that arose from technological change and economic development. The historian David A. Gerber notes, quote, "By the turn of the century, only 8 Cincinnati blacks were found in trade unions in the building trades. The majority were older men, most bricklayers, and of the latter, all were said to be so light in color as not to be noticed among the sunburned and brick dust covered men. At the same time, Cincinnati's bricklayers, locals, refused to honor the traveling cards of visiting union-affiliated black bricklayers. End quote. Footnote. Significantly, there was only one black apprentice, a female, reported in the 1890 census. Footnote. Increasingly, black business owners were patronized primarily by the small, relatively poor black community, as was the case in many other northern cities in the late 19th century. Like the barbers discussed above, early black pioneers in the legal and medical professions had white patrons, but toward the end of the century, they came to rely predominantly on black clients. This was a manifestation of the color line, but it also showed that the black community had become large enough to support a small number of black businesses and professionals. The exclusion of blacks from the growing number of white-collar jobs in the clerical and sales areas was particularly damaging, since these jobs generally offered upward mobility in the 19th century. These jobs required literate workers, and although thousands of black children attended the public schools from the 1850s on, there were only 58 black bookkeepers and clerks, 7 black sales workers, and 3 black stenographers in Cincinnati in 1890. Altogether, a mere 1% of the black labor force. Conclusion. From barbers and teachers to laborers and servants. Cincinnati's growing black community faced a variety of discriminatory barriers in the 19th century labor market, as well as in the educational system, which tended to confine black workers to relatively labor-intensive, low-paying, and low-status occupations. The result was a severe lack of occupational mobility in spite of the fact that black labor force participation rates were higher than those of whites. Moreover, when structural economic forces changed Cincinnati from an antebellum commercial center to an industrial city of the late 19th century, blacks' occupational status actually worsened. They experienced job dislocation from the decline of the steamboat and were denied the better job opportunities generated in the process of economic development. They were increasingly displaced from the more desirable occupations they had managed to find niches in, such as barber and teacher, and were left with the declining job categories that were being deserted by white workers, laborers, and servants. This occurred despite the significant decline in legal, formalized racism in late 19th century Ohio. It would appear that the more informal varieties of racial discrimination proved more than equal to the task of keeping blacks at the bottom of the occupational ladder. Although much of Cincinnati's foreign immigration occurred during the pre-industrial era, the continuing presence of large numbers of first and second generation white immigrants allowed Cincinnati employers, who were sometimes actively encouraged in this by immigrants, to avoid hiring blacks for the new jobs created by the dynamic forces of industrialization. Significant progress in the occupational rise of Cincinnati's blacks had to await the 20th century, when labor shortages created by the world wars, combined with better educational opportunities and legal challenges to employment discrimination, finally gave blacks a degree of access to the better jobs that had been created by the industrialization process. Even so, one may well ask whether this progress was too little, too late. As the U.S. economy shifts from an industrial to a post-industrial economy, many of the manufacturing-based jobs that blacks won after decades of struggle are the very jobs that are becoming obsolete. Thus, as we near the end of the 20th century, the labor market status of blacks remains troublesome. Occupations such as household servant, custodian, and restaurant worker remain all too common for black workers, and they clearly have their roots in the pre-industrial 19th century experience discussed above, while the industrial era jobs that blacks belatedly gained access to are now on the decline. The substantial occupational achievements of middle-class blacks who have broken into fields such as public administration, education, medicine, and law have unfortunately been accompanied by a disastrous lack of progress in the labor market for the majority of blacks. The 19th century experience of Cincinnati blacks suggests that the United States' current structural economic changes cannot be relied upon to produce economic opportunities that benefit blacks, even when combined with a decline in formalized racial barriers. So where the laws came into effect, individuals, companies, they took the place of the laws and solidified racism in Cincinnati and elsewhere. The employers, their employees, solidified. They did the work of the laws once the laws were dismantled. No wonder they didn't want to live next door to us. They were working against us. They didn't want to work with us. They didn't want us to work and have employment. Oh, don't even get me started. Let me finish this. Continuing informal barriers based on race, as well as the cumulative effects of past discrimination, mean that conscious analysis and concerted action will be required to truly upgrade the occupational status of the black community as a whole. And this was published in 1993. How much more in 2019? It speaks to reparations. It does not say it, but it most certainly speaks to reparations. Continuing informal barriers based on race, as well as the cumulative effects of past discrimination, mean that conscious analysis and concerted action will be required to truly upgrade the occupational status of the black community as a whole. Cincinnati, it is time to make us whole.